My family called me a failure and disowned me. Now they're begging for my help. The crisp morning air of late autumn carried the scent of wet leaves and the distant murmur of city life, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension that hung heavy in the Thorne family's opulent, yet increasingly somber, drawing room. Dust motes danced in the shafts of weak sunlight that pierced the leaded glass windows, illuminating the faded grandeur of velvet drapes and antique mahogany furniture. The very air felt thick, heavy with unspoken anxieties and the acrid tang of desperation. Leander Thorne, the elder brother, stood before the antique mahogany fireplace, his silhouette framed by those very windows that overlooked the sprawling, manicured gardens, now a testament to a fading glory. His face, usually a mask of smug self-assurance, was etched with a desperate, almost feral triumph as he clutched a sheaf of papers. Dark circles smudged beneath his eyes, and his shoulders, typically broad and confident, seemed to sag under an invisible weight. "It's done," he declared, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely concealed a tremor of raw anxiety. The words seemed forced through a constricted throat, a fragile declaration against a tide of impending ruin. "The board has approved the restructuring. We're moving forward. Thorne Construction will survive this." A collective sigh of relief, fragile and fleeting, rippled through the gathered family members of the parents, their faces pale and drawn, a network of fine lines now deep furrows of worry. An aunt, her pearls clutched tightly, her expression a mix of hope and nervous prayers. An uncle, his usual bluster deflated, and a scattering of cousins, all beneficiaries of the crumbling empire, their gazes glued to Leander. Their eyes, however, remained fixed on him, a mixture of hope and profound weariness. They believed his words, or rather, they needed to believe them. For them, Leander was the last bastion, the one who held the keys to their gilded cage, even as the walls began to crack and the bars started to bend. The air, though momentarily lighter, still pulsed with the underlying fear that this was but a temporary reprieve, a whisper of false hope. He sat in an armchair by the bay window, a book of architectural sketches resting, unread, on his lap. His presence there was an anomaly, a concession granted only because the family's situation had become truly dire, a desperate measure that allowed for the return of the prodigal son. He had received a terse, almost apologetic summons from his mother, a plea for family unity in the face of impending catastrophe, a desperate attempt to gather all their resources, however unconventional. His expression was serene, betraying nothing of the intricate web of knowledge and foresight that had been meticulously woven over years. His gaze drifted past Leander, past the anxious faces of his family, towards the distant cityscape, where a new era of architecture was silently rising, brick by meticulous brick, with a vision entirely different from the one that had built the Thorne Empire. Leander's eyes, sharp and accusatory, found his across the room. A familiar flicker of contempt, a habit deeply ingrained from childhood, crossed his features. "Caspian?" he sneered, a familiar venom lacing his tone, though it sounded weaker, more forced, than in years past. He supposed Caspian was enjoying this, wasn't he? The prodigal son, returned to witness the fall. Well, Caspian wouldn't get his satisfaction. Thorne Construction would not only survive, it would thrive. They had secured an opportunity, a massive government contract that would redefine the landscape of urban development. A contract that demanded a level of innovation that Caspian's quaint little eco-projects could never hope to touch. Leander puffed out his chest, a flicker of his old arrogance returning, despite the pallor of his skin and the tremor in his voice. They were talking about real money, real power, Caspian. Not some tree-hugging fantasy. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Caspian's lips. It wasn't a smile of malice, nor of vengeance, but of quiet understanding, the kind that comes from possessing a complete puzzle while others still scrambled for scattered pieces. The government contract Leander spoke of, the one he believed was their salvation, was indeed massive. But Leander, in his tunnel vision of conventional power and material wealth, understood only a fraction of its true nature. He knew the what, but not the how, and certainly not the who. Caspian's silence was not weakness, but a well-guarded secret, a strategic reserve of information that, in due time, would reshape everything. Leander had declared his victory, but Caspian knew the game was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The air of false triumph in the room felt like a thin veil over a vast, undiscovered truth. To truly understand the weight of that moment, one must trace the winding path that led him back to that suffocating drawing room. His story, much like a carefully planned architectural project, had its foundational blueprints laid in early childhood, sketches that diverged sharply from the rigid schematics of the Thorne family legacy. From a young age, he saw the world not as a collection of structures to be built, but as an ecosystem to be respected, a delicate balance to be maintained. While Leander, for years his senior, was poring over blueprints of high-rises and discussing profit margins with their father, meticulously learning the language of concrete and steel, Caspian was mesmerized by the intricate root systems of trees, the thermal properties of natural materials, and the elegant efficiency of biophilic design. He would spend hours in the sprawling family gardens, not admiring the perfectly manicured lawns, but observing the subtle interplay of light and shadow on leaves, the way water collected and flowed, the resilience of a climbing vine. Their family business, Thorne Construction Group, was a monolithic entity, built on generations of concrete, steel, and a philosophy that prioritized speed and cost efficiency above all else. His father, a man of stern practicality, with calloused hands and a mind built for ledgers and deadlines, saw Caspian's burgeoning interest in sustainability as a naive hobby, an expensive distraction from the real work of building an empire, a fanciful pursuit for someone who didn't understand the harsh realities of the market. Leander, however, saw it as an affront. He was the chosen heir, groomed from birth to take the reins, to inherit the mantle of power and continue the legacy. Caspian's unconventional thoughts, his quiet critiques of their environmentally detrimental practices, were perceived as a challenge to his authority, a sign of weakness in the family line, an unwelcome deviation from the established path. He reveled in his role as the elder brother, the pragmatic successor, constantly reminding Caspian of his perceived shortcomings. "Dreamer," he'd scoff, his voice laced with derision, a favorite epithet. "You think you can build with twigs and mud, Caspian? The world needs skyscrapers, not treehouses. We build what lasts, what makes money." He would often try to physically block Caspian's view of the architectural models their father presented, as if to deny his very presence in the family's future. The friction grew steadily over the years, a slow-burning fire beneath the surface of family decorum, culminating in a bitter confrontation when he was 24. He had just graduated with honors in architectural design, specializing in sustainable practices, a field still considered niche and unproven by the established industry, often dismissed as idealistic and impractical. His father had offered him a position at Thorne Construction, a junior role, far below his qualifications, with the implicit understanding that he would abandon his sustainable ideals and conform to their methods, that he would finally grow up and become a proper Thorne. Caspian refused. He laid out a passionate argument for integrating green technologies, for future-proofing their designs, for building with responsibility and foresight. He spoke of rising sea levels, carbon footprints, resource depletion, and the inevitable shift in public and governmental priorities. Leander predictably erupted. "This is lunacy, Caspian," he had roared, his face flushed with anger, spittle flying from his lips. "You're throwing away a legacy, a fortune, for some fantastical notion of building with moss. Do you know how much money they'd lose adapting to his ridiculous demands? You're a failure, Caspian. A A complete and utter failure if you can't see the value of what they've built, what they offer him. The words were designed to wound, to diminish, to reassert Leander's dominance. His father, his face grim, delivered the final blow, his voice quiet but firm, imbued with the weight of generations of expectation. If you walk away from this, Caspian, you walk away from us. From the family name, you make your own bed. And so he walked, disowned, branded a failure. He left the opulent Thorn estate with little more than a small inheritance from his grandmother, a woman who, in her quiet way, had always understood his gentle spirit and given him books on nature and art, and an unshakable belief in his vision. The years that followed were arduous, marked by lean times, relentless work, and the constant struggle to convince a skeptical industry of the viability of sustainable design. He faced countless rejections, doors slammed in his face, and whispers of his family's disappointment that preceded him in many professional circles. This period of ostracism, however, became his crucible. It forced him to build from the ground up, relying solely on his intellect, his passion, and his burgeoning skills. He worked tirelessly, not for fame or fortune, but for the profound satisfaction of creating structures that harmonized with their environment, that consumed less and gave back more. He sought out mentors who shared his vision, pioneering architects and engineers who were quietly revolutionizing the industry, often operating on the fringes much like himself. He attended obscure conferences, published papers in academic journals that were often dismissed by the mainstream, and meticulously studied global trends in environmental policy and urban planning. He learned to speak the language of finance and policy, not just design, understanding that true change required bridging disciplines. This was where his secret weapon began to take shape. It wasn't a single invention, but a confluence of deep knowledge, strategic foresight, and an invaluable network. While Leander was busy leveraging Thorn Construction's conventional might to churn out financially lucrative but environmentally short-sighted projects, engaging in aggressive bidding wars and costly land acquisitions, Caspian was building relationships with the very people who would shape the future of urban development. Government policymakers drafting new regulations, leading environmental scientists conducting groundbreaking research, and cutting-edge material innovators developing revolutionary building solutions. He became an authority, quietly earning a reputation as one of the few architects who truly understood the intricate dance between ecology, economy, and human well-being, someone who could translate visionary ideas into practical, viable projects. Crucially, he cultivated a deep understanding of upcoming legislation and global initiatives. He knew, long before Thorn Construction ever caught wind of it, about the government's ambitious Green City Initiative, a multi-billion-dollar project designed to transform urban landscapes into sustainable, resilient hubs. He understood its core requirements. Not just eco-friendly design, but verifiable, cutting-edge solutions for carbon neutrality, water recycling, renewable energy integration, and community engagement. He knew the specific metrics, the ethical clauses, the political drivers behind it, the public pressure points, and the long-term vision of its proponents. This wasn't merely a contract. It was a paradigm shift, and he had been preparing for it for years, not as a means to spite his family, but as a commitment to his life's work, a dedication to a future he believed in. His silent preparation was his most potent counter-strategy. He was building a future, brick by painstaking brick, while Leander was merely trying to shore up a crumbling past with conventional, unsustainable methods. As the years progressed, his quiet dedication began to yield significant results. His small firm, Ecotech Solutions, slowly but steadily gained recognition. They started with smaller, residential projects, a solar-powered suburban home, a community garden with integrated rainwater harvesting, a small office building with natural ventilation systems, meticulously proving the economic viability and environmental benefits of sustainable design. Each successful project became a testament, a concrete argument against the conventional wisdom that eco-friendly meant impractical or overly expensive. His designs were not just green. They were intelligent, beautiful, and remarkably efficient, often exceeding client expectations in terms of energy savings and occupant well-being. He cultivated a team of like-minded individuals, passionate and dedicated, who shared his vision and his meticulous approach, creating a culture built on innovation and integrity. While his reputation grew in the specialized circles of sustainable architecture, he remained largely invisible to the mainstream construction giants like Thorn Construction. This suited him perfectly. His strategy was not one of overt confrontation, but of quiet, inexorable progress, like water slowly eroding stone. While Leander focused on dominating the existing market with its established, albeit outdated, methods, pursuing lucrative but short-sighted contracts, Caspian was quietly cultivating the future, planting seeds for a new paradigm. Leander, blinded by his own hubris and the increasingly frantic need to keep Thorn Construction afloat, dismissed his emerging success as irrelevant. He saw his firm as a boutique operation, a niche curiosity, incapable of competing with the big players. His public statements, when Caspian's name occasionally surfaced in industry publications, were dismissive, laced with thinly veiled pity. "Caspian is still playing in his sandbox," he'd once told a reporter, a sneer audible even in the printed word. While they're building cities, he believed that scale and established power were the only metrics that mattered, completely missing the tectonic shifts occurring beneath the industry's surface. Meanwhile, Thorn Construction Group was facing a perfect storm. Leander, desperate to maintain their market share and projected profits, had embarked on a series of aggressive, large-scale projects that completely disregarded environmental impact and ethical sourcing. There was the ill-fated Oasis Towers project, a luxury condominium complex built on reclaimed wetlands, pushed through with questionable permits, which subsequently suffered catastrophic structural failures due to soil instability and provoked a massive environmental lawsuit, drawing the ire of powerful advocacy groups. Then came the industrial hub, a massive factory complex with outdated waste disposal systems that led to severe water and air pollution in a nearby underprivileged community, triggering widespread public protests, class action lawsuits, and hefty government fines that crippled their balance sheets. Each failure chipped away at the company's already precarious financial standing and, more critically, its public image. The Thorn name, once synonymous with reliability and power, was now increasingly associated with environmental destruction, corporate greed, and structural incompetence. He watched from a calculated distance, not with glee, but with a sense of grim inevitability, like observing a slow-motion car crash he had long predicted. He received regular updates through his extensive network, whispers from within government agencies, data from environmental watchdog groups, and even disgruntled former employees of Thorn Construction, some of whom had quietly sought out Ecotech solutions for new opportunities. He learned of their escalating debts, their frustrated lenders, their desperate attempts to secure new capital, and the increasing panic of their board of directors as the empire began to truly crumble. His plan in motion was subtle, almost imperceptible from the outside. He continued to build his portfolio, focusing on projects that perfectly aligned with the emerging requirements of the Green City Initiative, almost as if he were rehearsing for the grand performance. He subtly collaborated with key figures in the government's urban planning department, offering insights and technical expertise on complex sustainable solutions, solidifying his position as an indispensable thought leader in the sustainable development space. He never directly attacked Thorn Construction. Their own actions were doing a far more effective job of dismantling their legacy. Instead, he simply presented the alternative, the solution, making Ecotech Solutions the quiet, undeniable answer to the very problems Thorn Construction was creating. The Zygarnik effect was at play here, the psychological phenomenon where an uncompleted task occupies one's mind more than a completed one. Leander was aware of the mounting problems, the financial strain, the public outcry. He knew something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't grasp the full scope of his miscalculation, nor could he see the solution slowly forming around him. His focus remained on short-term fixes, on securing any contract, however ill-suited, to keep the company afloat, like a drowning man grasping at straws. He was trapped in a self-inflicted crisis, completely unaware that the very solution he needed was embodied by the person he had so vehemently dismissed. He was frantically building a dam against a rising tide, while Caspian was silently charting a new course for the river. Leander saw Caspian's silence as resignation, his calm as indifference, his continued dedication to his niche as further proof of his irrelevance. He couldn't have been more wrong. Every failed project of Leander's, every sneering comment directed at Caspian's quaint ideals, was merely tightening the snare around his own neck, making the eventual reveal all the more potent, all the more crushing. The summons for the emergency family meeting arrived on a dreary Tuesday afternoon. It was succinct, almost brusque, signed by his father, the Thorn Construction Group letterhead stark against the cream paper. The subject line simply read, "Urgent family matter, Thorn Construction." He knew precisely what it meant. The net had finally tightened. The walls had finally given way. The meeting took place that evening in the grand, but now decidedly bleak, Thorn dining room. The room, usually a vibrant space for lavish dinners, felt cavernous and cold, the crystal chandelier casting too little light, too many shadows. The air was thick with unspoken fear and resentment, a palpable desperation. His parents sat at the head of the long mahogany table, their faces etched with despair, looking years older than he remembered. Leander paced at the far end, a caged animal, his usual polished veneer completely cracked, his movements jerky and agitated. The other family members, aunts, uncles, cousins, sat in various states of agitation, their whispered conversations dying as he entered, their gazes flitting nervously towards him, then quickly away, as if unable to hold his calm stare. "Caspian," his father began, his voice hoarse, strained, an uncharacteristic tremor in his usually firm tone. "Thank you for coming. We are in a truly dire situation." Leander stopped pacing, his eyes flitting between Caspian and the other family members, a wild desperation in their depths. "Dire is an understatement, father," he spat, his voice strained, a raw edge to it. They were on the precipice of bankruptcy. The lawsuits from the Oasis Towers and industrial hub projects, the fines, the public backlash, it's all come crashing down. He slammed his fist on the table, making the silverware rattle, a pathetic attempt to assert control. Their investors were pulling out. The banks were calling in loans. They had one and only one chance. He looked around the table, his gaze lingering on each anxious face, building the tension, trying to create an audience for his desperate gambit. The government's Green City Initiative project. It's a multi-billion-dollar contract, the biggest urban development tender in decades. If they secured it, they survive. They rebuild. They restore the Thorn name. His voice rose, desperation lending it a manic edge. But it's not like anything they've done before. It required cutting-edge sustainable design, environmentally sound practices, community integration, technologies they didn't possess, expertise they lacked. He avoided looking directly at Caspian, the words catching in his throat, a bitter admission of his own inadequacy. The room fell silent, the implication hanging heavy in the air. The family members exchanged nervous glances, their eyes darting towards Caspian, then quickly away, their faces a mix of dawning understanding and profound discomfort. The irony was a palpable presence, suffocating Leander, clinging to his very skin. He struggled with the words, his face contorting in a mixture of pride, humiliation, and raw need. They needed external consultation. He finally choked out, his voice barely audible, the admission tearing at his pride. Someone with a proven track record in innovative, eco-friendly design. He still wouldn't look at Caspian directly, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond his shoulder. The government agency had made it clear. They wanted a design that was beyond reproach, ethically and environmentally. They wanted a new standard. His mother, her eyes pleading, wet with tears, finally looked at Caspian. "Caspian, please, son." Her voice was barely a whisper. A desperate olive branch extended across years of bitterness and neglect. Your father and she, they'd always believed in him deep down. They knew he'd made a name for himself in that field. Perhaps he could lend his expertise, just for this one project, for the family. Caspian remained calm, his expression unreadable, a quiet pool in the storm of their desperation. He took a slow, deliberate sip of water, allowing the silence to stretch, building the anticipation, the Zygarnik effect at its peak. All eyes fixated on him. Every eye was on him, a mixture of hope, dread, and incredulity. He appreciated the belated acknowledgement. "Mother," he said, his voice quiet, cutting through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and unfeeling. But his expertise was not something that could simply be lent for a single project. Leander finally snapped, his control breaking entirely. "Don't be deliberately difficult, Caspian." This was the family's survival. His little experiments in tree-hugging had clearly made him arrogant beyond measure. This was not some hobby project for him to play around with. This was real business. He was shouting now, his face red, his voice raw with frustration and a deep-seated fear. Caspian met his furious gaze, his own eyes calm and unwavering, holding Leander's frantic stare. Real business, Leander, required foresight. It required understanding the direction the world was moving, not clinging to outdated methods. It required integrity, not just profit margins. He paused, letting the words sink in, allowing their weight to press down on Leander. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sleek, government-embossed folder. He placed it gently on the table, sliding it towards Leander, who stared at it with a mix of confusion and dread. The Green City Initiative, as Leander called it. Caspian began, his voice gaining a quiet authority that commanded absolute attention, silencing the room completely. Was a project he'd been intimately involved with for the better part of the last 3 years. Not as a consultant, Leander. Not as a hopeful bidder. He opened the folder, revealing an official letterhead, the government seal prominent. As of 2 weeks ago, Ecotech Solutions was formally selected as the lead design firm for the entire Green City Initiative project. They'd been working closely with the government's project development team, defining the very parameters and technical specifications Leander was now desperately trying to understand. A collective gasp rippled through the room, a wave of stunned realization. His parents stared, their mouths agape, unable to process the magnitude of the revelation. His aunts and uncles looked like they'd seen a ghost, their faces pale, their eyes wide. Leander, however, was the most profoundly affected. He stumbled back, clutching the edge of the table for support, his face draining of all color, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, horrifying realization. He looked down at the folder, then back at Caspian, his jaw slack, a pathetic croak attempting to escape his throat. The letter, clearly stating Ecotech Solutions' appointment, was irrefutable, an undeniable testament to a reality he had completely ignored. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice a pathetic croak, barely audible above the ringing silence. Caspian, he was just a small firm. How? While Thorn Construction was busy cutting corners and destroying ecosystems, Leander, Caspian explained, his voice devoid of triumph, merely stating facts, cold and hard as the truth itself. Ecotech Solutions was building a reputation based on innovation, ethical practice, and genuine sustainability. They were preparing for the future, not desperately clinging to the past. The government didn't just want a builder, they wanted a visionary. Someone who understood the profound shift required for truly sustainable urban living. And they came to him. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing Leander's, holding him captive. So, when Leander said Thorn Construction needed cutting-edge sustainable design expertise, he was, in fact, saying that Thorn Construction needed him, not as a consultant, but as a subcontractor if he were even to consider such a thing. And given Thorn Construction's abysmal track record, their reputation, and the ethical breaches they'd committed, securing any part of this project would be an uphill battle of epic proportions. The bid requirements were stringent, the public oversight was intense, and the lead firm, Leander, had absolute discretion over its partners. The very partner who was once disowned and called a failure by this family. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Leander's ragged breathing and the faint tick of a grandfather clock in the hall. His eyes, once full of contempt, now held a terrifying blend of fear and utter defeat. The tables had not just turned. They had been utterly, irrevocably inverted, leaving Leander at the mercy of the man he had scorned. The immediate aftermath of the reveal was a chaotic symphony of disbelief and desperate pleas. Leander, his face ashen, stumbled towards Caspian, the earlier bravado replaced by a pathetic, almost animalistic fear. "Caspian, no, this couldn't be," he stammered, his voice choked, his hands reaching out as if to grasp at a phantom lifeline. He had to help them. Please, for the family. They'd do whatever he wanted. Any terms, any conditions. His eyes, usually sharp with ambition, were now clouded with utter desperation, reflecting a man who had lost everything. His transformation was startling. The pompous, arrogant titan of industry was reduced to a sniveling, desperate man. His shoulders slumped, his posture defeated. His parents, witnessing Leander's complete collapse, rushed forward, their earlier sternness melting into a torrent of apologies and entreaties. "Caspian, please, son." His mother wept, tears streaming down her face, her hands clasped in prayer. They were wrong, so terribly wrong. They didn't understand his vision. They were blind. His father, his voice cracking, added, "His brother, he was misled. They were all misled. But he, Caspian, he was the only hope. Don't let the Thorn name perish." The weight of generations of pride and expectation now rested on Caspian's shoulders, twisted into a plea. The other family members, once quick to echo Leander's dismissive remarks, now chimed in, a chorus of sudden adoration and regret, their faces contorted with forced sincerity. They spoke of his brilliance, his foresight, his unwavering commitment, as if they had always recognized it, as if their past disdain had never existed. It was a stark, almost grotesque display of self-preservation, their sudden change of heart born not of genuine remorse, but of stark necessity, a desperate attempt to cling to the last vestiges of their privileged existence. Caspian remained outwardly composed, his mind clear amidst the emotional deluge. He allowed them their desperate pleas, their belated apologies. It was important for them to vocalize their predicament, to fully grasp the depth of their misjudgment, to truly understand the consequences of their actions. He watched Leander, the man who had gleefully cast him aside, now begging for a lifeline. There was no joy in this, no sense of cheap vindication, only a quiet, profound understanding of the cyclical nature of consequence, of the seeds they had sown and the harvest they were now reaping. "Help them?" he finally spoke, his voice calm, cutting through their pleas like a cool breeze through a feverish room. They branded him a failure. They disowned him for pursuing his passion. They actively sabotaged his reputation within their circles. They ridiculed every principle he stood for. And now, when their conventional empire was crumbling, built on the very unsustainable practices he had warned them against. They expected him to simply provide a solution. He let the questions hang in the air, rhetorical and damning. Leander fell to his knees, literally, a broken man. He was wrong, Caspian. He was a fool, arrogant, blind. He begged him. What could he do? What could they do to make this right? Partnership? They'd give him a controlling stake. Anything. His pleas were raw, desperate, devoid of any dignity. Caspian looked at him, then at his parents, their faces ravaged by despair, their eyes pleading. The Green City Initiative was not just a construction project, Leander. It was a commitment, a testament to a new way of building, a new way of living. It required absolute ethical transparency, a flawless environmental record, and a genuine belief in its core mission. Thorn Construction, as it stood, embodied none of that. Their track record was a direct antithesis to everything this project represented. Every failed project, every lawsuit, every environmental disaster that led them to this precipice. They were all public knowledge. They were disqualifiers, insurmountable obstacles to integrity. He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to sink in, to crush any lingering hope. His firm, Ecotech Solutions, had worked tirelessly to build the reputation and trust necessary to lead this initiative. Aligning with Thorn Construction, even as a subcontractor, would compromise the integrity of the entire project. It would be a betrayal of every principle he had ever stood for, and it would jeopardize the entire Green City Initiative for future generations, for the very planet he sought to protect. There was a finality in his tone that extinguished their last flicker of hope. Leander slumped to the floor, defeated, a shell of his former self. His parents collapsed into their chairs, their faces etched with the bitter agony of regret, the crushing weight of their choices finally settling upon them. The fallout was immediate and absolute. The news of Thorn Construction's imminent bankruptcy hit the media within days. A sensational story of a fallen empire. The family, once shielded by their wealth and name, was now exposed. Their internal struggles and failures laid bare for public consumption. The once mighty Thorn Construction Group, a symbol of conventional power, began its agonizing, public descent into financial ruin. The empire built on concrete and contempt was finally dissolving, leaving behind only the dust of its own short-sightedness and a bitter lesson learned too late. Years have passed since that evening in the Thorn dining room. The dust of the Thorn Construction Group's collapse has long settled, leaving behind only echoes in the annals of business history. The once dominant company, unable to adapt, unable to secure the lifeline Caspian could not, in good conscience, extend, eventually dissolved. Its assets were liquidated, its grand buildings sold off, and its name faded from the city skyline. Leander, stripped of his inherited power and wealth, faded into obscurity, a bitter man consumed by his past failures, his arrogance replaced by a quiet, gnawing resentment, unable to escape the shadow of his own making. His parents, though deeply wounded by the loss of their legacy, eventually came to terms with the consequences of their choices. Their initial shock gave way to a quiet, if painful, understanding. They rarely contacted him, and when they did, it was with a newfound humility, devoid of any demands or expectations, a recognition of his true path. His own life, however, soared. The Green City Initiative was a monumental success. Ecotech Solutions, under his leadership, delivered a groundbreaking urban development that became a global benchmark for sustainable living. They integrated cutting-edge renewable energy systems that powered entire districts, innovative water recycling plants that purified and reused every drop, expansive green spaces that fostered biodiversity and well-being, and community-centric designs that fostered a genuine sense of belonging and collaboration among its residents. The project garnered international acclaim, earning numerous awards and accolades, cementing his reputation as a visionary in the field of sustainable architecture. a true pioneer. His firm grew exponentially, but not at the expense of their core values. They continued to prioritize ethical practice, environmental responsibility, and human well-being above all else, refusing contracts that compromised their principles, no matter how lucrative. He found immense satisfaction not in the financial rewards, which were substantial, but in the tangible impact of their work. Cleaner air, thriving communities, and buildings that truly respected the planet, that lived in harmony with the natural world rather than dominating it. He often reflects on that tumultuous period of his life. The bitterness, the rejection, the arduous path he chose, they were not burdens, but catalysts. They forced him to forge his own identity, to define his own version of success, untainted by the expectations and conventional metrics of his family. He learned that true strength lies not in inherited power or material wealth, but in unwavering integrity, in the courage to pursue one's passion, and in the wisdom to recognize that true value extends far beyond the bottom line, beyond fleeting profits or public acclaim. There is a profound peace in knowing that he built his success on his own terms, with his own hands, guided by his own convictions. The failure they labeled him became the very foundation of his greatest triumph. The irony is not lost on him, nor is the powerful lesson it imparts. Life has a remarkable way of delivering justice, often not in explosive moments of vengeance, but through the quiet, persistent unfolding of consequences. The true measure of success is not how loudly one proclaims their victories, but how authentically one lives their truth, how resiliently one pursues their purpose, and how much value one brings to the world, regardless of who believes in them. In the end, what truly matters is not the fleeting approval of others, but the unshakable conviction of one's own integrity. Stay true to your vision, cultivate your unique strengths, and trust that your quiet determination will eventually carve out the path to your well-deserved triumph. This story of resilience, integrity, and unexpected justice is just one of many that we share on this channel. If you were moved by Caspian's journey and the powerful lessons it holds, you'll find many more narratives of triumph over adversity right here. Don't miss out on our next deep dive into stories of life-changing decisions and extraordinary comebacks. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you're always the first to know when a new story drops. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a similar act of ingratitude or dismissal only to find your own path to success? Or perhaps, if you were in Caspian's shoes, what choice would you have made when your family came begging for help? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Let's start a conversation.